And here we are at the end of week 3. This was, as you can tell, we're really ramping up the amount of material we've got each week. We have to do that in order to get through everything in 8 weeks. So I'm not going to spend this wrap up trying to cover everything that was in this week's material, but I do want to focus on the what I believe is primarily the most important concepts, and talk a little bit about some things that will be useful to you in the for your projects. So I'm going to focus on a kind of just a generalized summary of consumer behavior and how we approach the analysis of consumer behavior, and further how we would use that in our marketing plan. So let's go ahead and get started with that.
So quick outline, our 5 main topics for this lecture. We'll talk quickly about how consumer behavior works. We'll talk about the influence of cultural and social influences on consumer decision making. And we'll talk about the psychological influences that motivate consumers, a little bit about consumer motivation, behavioral influences on consumer decisions, and then we'll follow that up with the consumer decision making process. So as this image shows, we can really describe the entire consumer behavior model, if you will, as your consumer decision making being driven by a process, the consumer decision making process, that itself is driven by cultural, social, individual, and psychological factors. So we've got the consumer decision making process here, the cultural and social factors, and the individual factors and psychological factors all contribute to this process, which results in a decision to buy or not buy, or to act or not act. It doesn't always have to lead to a purchase decision, but some desired outcome that the marketers are asking for. We'll talk first about the cultural factors that influence consumer behavior. And as you can see here, there are a lot of cultural factors. When we talk about culture in consumer behavior and how it impacts decision making, these 7 components of culture are the driving variables. But we're really talking about things that impact people's lives based on how they were raised by their parents, based on the area that they lived in, based on the as you can see, things like the values and the customs that are existent within the within the culture that they grew up within. That sets things like your values, your language, your customs and rituals, the laws that you abide by, and even material artifacts, meaning symbols and the extent to which physical goods represent things about your culture. So the need to wear a baseball cap, the need to buy a Christmas tree and have that be present in your house is a culturally driven consumption behavior. So it's not difficult to see how the culture that you grow up in, the culture that you're brought up in, will influence your consumer decision making. But even from the more important standpoint, from the marketer standpoint, it's important for we as marketers to understand the cultural components of a target audience, and certainly even define target audiences based on the culture and cultural influences that will impact their decision. We can also talk about social factors, and one of the primary social factors that can influence decision making is that of reference groups. Now, reference groups are defined as a group of people who are used as a guide for behavior in specific situations. So there's a couple key reference groups that we would talk about. Certainly one would be opinion leaders. Opinion leaders certainly are like people that you consider experts in an area, people whose opinion you would seek out for a decision. So if I'm buying a new computer and I don't know much about computers, but my brother does, I'm going to go to my brother and I'm going to say, hey, what do you think about this particular laptop? Is this a good one? Is this a not? And I'll also certainly rely on that information as an expert source. And actually, as it turns out, that example would actually satisfy both of these definitions of reference groups, family as well. And family is a key reference group because in many consumer decision-making situations, the decision is not only influenced by family, but it's influenced by family because the decision itself will be an influence on the family. So when I buy a new car, I certainly have to consider not only my needs, but the needs of the family as well, and certainly consider their opinions. My wife doesn't like that color, even though it's my car, she doesn't like it, so that's going to influence how I approach that decision. Again, the key here being for marketers, we said before, we need to understand their culture. We also need to understand what reference groups are they going to use, are they going to rely on when making the decision. These reference groups, as you can see, may serve as information sources. In the examples that I gave, they were doing that. They may affect aspiration levels. A good example of that would be, let's say I'm on a social softball team. I'm on an amateur softball team with my bunch of buddies, and I'm, as might not be surprising, the worst player on the team. Well, I might look to my teammates and my buddies who are better softball players than I am to see what kind of equipment they use. And I think, well, maybe that bat is better. Maybe I should be using that kind of a glove. Maybe that's the kind of ball cap that I need, and that'll make me a better player. Or something like that. That's what I aspire to. I look at these people as, I desire to be like this person, and so that may affect the way that I behave as a consumer. And at the same time, these reference groups, they may constrain or stimulate buying behaviors. I may choose to not buy something because of how I expect my reference groups to respond. And I've used this example in the past. There's a particular kind of car that I really like and I would love to drive. So this sporty, kind of cool car with a big rear wing on the back of it that's kind of silly looking, but still kind of cool. But there's no way I would ever buy that because I think that my peers would think that it's ridiculous. And they would probably be right. But so that would constrain my buying behavior because I wouldn't buy that because of how I think the reference groups would respond. So you can see the social impact on consumer behavior can be quite significant. And again, as marketers, we have to be aware of this. Certainly individual factors. We would hope that as individuals, we have control over the decisions that we make. We can talk about factors such as demographics, the statistical, personal, social, and economic characteristics that describe a population. So this would include things like age, sexual orientation, race and ethnicity, occupation, income, maybe even geography. So we can certainly describe a target audience based on these factors. And these things can have an impact on the way that we make decisions. However, I caution you to lend too much credence to the idea of demographics as a powerful predictor of behavior. Whereas with social or cultural factors, we can come to expect certain behaviors. With demographics, they're not often the best. So, for example, if we talk about segmenting people or targeting a group based on their demographics, and we say, well, I want to target 20-year-old men or 20 to 30-year-old men. Well, within that group of 20 to 30-year-old men, you're going to find an almost infinite number of behaviors, because even within that group, you still have the social and the cultural influences, the external influences that change the way people behave. Not every 20-year-old man is going to buy the same types of things, and he's even going to have the same types of desired needs. It's based on so many different things that that can often be a tricky point. It's very easy to think about, well, what kind of person should we talk to? Well, let's talk to young men. Let's talk to old women. Let's talk to college-aged, or teenage boys. See what they, and we think that describes a population accurately enough to predict their behavior. But the fact of the matter is, it's not enough. What we can do is we can tend to identify factors that will be predictive of behavior, and that are more predictive than demographics, and then use the demographics to describe that group. So, for example, we might say people of a particular culture with a certain set of friends, certain lifestyle. That's who we're targeting. And we also happen to know that they tend to be male. Now, we're not targeting because they're male, we're targeting them because of these other factors, but we know maybe they tend to also be male. So we can use it as what we'd call a descriptive variable as opposed to a segmentation variable. We'll actually get into that idea a lot more in detail next week in the segmentation, targeting, and positioning chapter. Then our final set of factors that influence consumer decision making are the psychological factors, and two primary psychological factors that we'll talk about. First is perception. Perception is the extent to which a consumer believes that he or she has a need. To what extent does my desired state match my actual state? And as we'll see in just a little bit, this perception of your desired and actual states, so they certainly can be impacted on marketing, but it's this perception that leads to the beginning of the decision-making process, because this essentially represents need recognition, which you read about in the textbook. The perception of that need is a very big influencer on decision-making, because again, it kicks off the decision-making process. We can also talk about motivation. Motivation is the desire to move from the current state to the ideal state. So even if a consumer were to perceive a difference between the current and ideal state, if they don't see that difference to be big enough or important enough, then they're not motivated to move. They're not motivated to address the need. So we have to understand sort of what motivates people to begin this process as well. Now, there's several different theories of motivation. The textbook really talks about primarily Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a very commonly known theory. But there's also this a more complex set of psychological motives called Maguire psychological motives. I invite you to Google that. There's a nice Wikipedia entry on it. There's some information out there on the internet about Maguire psychological motives. It's a much more complex and detailed set of motives. Actually accounts for 16 different potential sets of motivations. But Maslow is what we'll focus on here. When we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're talking about a set of needs that are defined by, in addition to other things, the order in which those needs tend to be fulfilled. And let's take a look at that. So I don't think this is exactly from the textbook, but it should be fairly similar. As we start from the top of this table here, and I'll just highlight it for you here, the psychological needs, and we move down towards self-actualization. Maslow's theory basically says that consumers will tend to satisfy these higher level needs, these psychological needs, before they get down and are able to fulfill the self-actualization. So until all of your psychological needs are sated, we won't move on to the safety needs. So if you're hungry, if you're cold, if you're sick, that's going to take precedence over moving towards making sure you're safe, or making sure you have friends, making sure you feel good about yourself, making sure that you've accomplished everything you can in your life, which is what these other levels do. So you can see some examples here. Psychological needs would include things like food, water, medicine, vitamins, exercise equipment. All these things satisfy physical needs, right? It's important, too, to point out, though, that any particular consumer decision may be satisfying multiple needs at once. So a good example of this would be an automobile. An automobile will could potentially satisfy safety needs, because it's much safer to drive to work or drive to the grocery store than it would be, say, to take the bus or the taxi, or to take your bike, or to walk. But it might also satisfy belongingness needs. If you buy a car that you think is something that would be appropriate for your friends, it could even satisfy esteem needs if it makes you feel good about yourself. And a lot of cars are marketed to this level, drive the ultimate, the ultimate driving machine, or treat yourself to the ultimate luxury automobile, right? These are esteem needs, and we could even perhaps talk about a car satisfying self-actualization needs. So for me, buying a Ferrari LaFerrari would certainly it's about a, I don't know, probably about a $400,000 exotic car would satisfy a self-actualization need, because that's the ultimate automobile, and there is nothing better. So, one car purchase could potentially satisfy all levels, all of those needs at the same time. But even if we're not talking about cars, even a meal, right? Going to Starbucks could satisfy physiological needs and belongingness needs at the same time. If you go with a friend and what you value out of that Starbucks transaction is getting the coffee and maybe a donut or something, but also spending time with your friends. Could even be an esteem need if you just hanging out at Starbucks makes you feel like a certain type of person that you want to be. That would satisfy esteem needs as well. So it's really important to keep in mind that any one particular product or service, any marketing offering, could potentially be attractive to satisfy needs at a variety of levels. So in addition to these motives that are suggested by either Maslow or Maguire, it's also important to note that any of these motives can be described as being either manifest or latent. So a manifest motive is basically any motive that a consumer self-identifies, right? So I would say that if I asked you, what need was satisfied when you bought this? Well, the example here is these J. Crew clothes. So the manifest motives are the things that are easily identifiable by the consumer. So the clothes are stylish, they come in a variety of sizes and colors. These are reasonable explanations for why I think that I need these clothes. But then there's also these latent motives, which are motives that I'm satisfying, but I'm not necessarily aware that I'm satisfying the need, or I'm not willing to express that it satisfies that need. So, for example, it will show that I'm sophisticated and trendy. Well, that sort of comes out of the idea that I want things that are stylish and come in a variety of sizes and colors. While that's the manifest motive, the latent motive that sort of is a driving motive of the manifest motive is that I want to look like I'm sophisticated and trendy, or it's an upscale and urbane brand that will help make me powerful and popular. Again, not something that consumers are willing to even attribute to a specific brand, but we know that it happens. So here's the trick. Manifest motives and latent motives both are drivers of consumer behavior. My suggestion, and the contention that I've always held to be true, is that latent motives are more important because they represent more truth. They represent something that's deep inside of you that really drives you to something larger. And so it's really important to be able to identify those. Part of the exercise that we'll be doing later is for you to actually do this, to actually talk to consumers and identify manifest and latent motives. And identifying those latent motives sometimes requires very deep probing behaviors, asking questions, and I like to describe this probing process as being sort of like the 4-year-old process of questioning, because you really just want to be asking why, and for every answer that you get, you should ask again, well, why? So, for example, why did you buy these J. Crew clothes? And a person says, well, because they're stylish. Well, why is that important to you? Why do you want them to be stylish? And then they may respond, well, because it makes me feel good to when I'm in stylish clothes. Well, why does the stylish clothes make you feel good? What is it about those? So it's that kind of probing, and yeah, honestly, it can be a little irritating, when you probe like that. But it really forces people to think a little more deeply than just on the surface of why they think these clothes are valuable to them or are fulfilling a need. So this probing idea, this idea of really getting down to the core of what people value in a product, can be really tricky, but is really a very important task when identifying what the motives are that are driving consumer behavior. All right, so now we need to talk a little bit about the consumer decision process, and this is laid out pretty well in the textbook, so I'll go through it fairly quickly and point out some interesting links here that might not have been obvious from the textbook. So first, the first stage of the consumer decision process is that of need recognition. So this is what I had referenced before about the whole idea of perception. Whenever a person believes that where they want to be is not where they are, and I don't mean physically where, but I mean the state of being that they're in. I'm hungry and I wish I were not hungry, so that there's a need recognized there. I don't have as many friends as I wish I had. That's a need, so that people will seek to fulfill. And any number of situations where we could describe a person wanting something that they don't have. Which brings me actually to an interesting point. When we talk about need recognition, needs can be obviously, anything on that Maslow's hierarchy, but this whole idea of things that I want but don't need is sort of it's an irrelevant question. As far as consumer behavior analysis is concerned, a want is a need. There is no difference between a want and a need. The only difference is what level of Maslow's hierarchy we're talking about. So that self-actualization needs, almost all of those some people might describe as wants, but you don't need it to survive, certainly. But it is a desire that you have to have the car when you don't have the car. There's a desire to have that status when you don't have that status. So when we talk about wants or needs, we're really talking about the same thing, just different types of needs. Marketers, part of marketers' job in need recognition is to stimulate this. We can do one of two things. We can either activate a latent motive, so make people realize that a latent motive that they have exists, or we can simply stimulate a manifest motive, just accentuate the idea that that need is there. Once this need has been recognized and a person decides that the difference between the actual state and the desired state is large enough for them to act on, they'll engage in information search. And an information search may be casual, it may be formal. Another way to think about casual or formal information search is we can talk about it being either internal or external. Internal information search being essentially searching your own memory. So what have I done when I had this kind of need discrepancy in the past? Did it work? Did it not work? What do I know about this? What have I learned about the product category? What options are there out there? That would be the casual or informal search, casual or internal search. And then formal search would be my Google searches, my asking friends, my going to the store and talking to a salesperson, any of these, paying attention to the TV commercials about the things in that category. This would be more formal or external information search. Now the interesting thing here is obviously depending on the nature of the problem and the importance of the problem and the difficulty of solving the problem, that'll have an impact on the type of information that the consumer searches for. So very simple problems, I'll rely more on casual or internal search. Very complex or new types of problems, I'll rely more on formal or external information. Now, part of the information that I'll be searching for is what alternatives are available, what are the possible solutions to my problem. So the next stage is actually evaluating those. What are the options and which one is the best option? There are a lot of different decision rules that people use to evaluate these alternatives, and that's far more complex than we have the time to get into right now. But essentially consumers simply compare them, apply certain decision rules, identify attributes of each that are important, and then hopefully the consumer is able to come to an actual purchase decision. Now, interesting point about the purchase decision. So you can see in the slide here, often this decision is a two-part decision. First is the brand selection, the second is the outlet selection. The outlet, where are you actually going to purchase it? Now, the reason this is interesting is because when you think about it from the standpoint of brand and outlet choices being independent from one another, you realize that these decision processes are actually, there's actually two independent ones here. And those decisions can come in any order. That is, you can select the brand first and then the outlet, or the outlet first and then the brand. In which case, if you were to select the brand first, then the outlet selection begins with the brand selection representing sort of the need recognition for the outlet selection process. So these two decision processes are intertwined, very much related, but that also means that it's very important to know how the consumer is going to proceed. Are they going to be brand first, or are they going to be outlet first? That will have a very significant impact on your marketing decisions. For example, if you know that the decision will tend to be made brand first, then, for example, your advertising needs to be very brand specific and perhaps point out. And I'm sorry. So your brand, if brand is first, then your marketing activities should focus on things like extensive distribution. Your messaging needs to be perhaps very competitive. So saying why this brand is better than the other brand. And as long as you have extensive distribution, the person will be able to find the brand wherever it is that they go. On the other hand, if they're outlet first, then you need to focus on things like retailer advertising, like exclusive distribution. Make sure that your brand is the only brand in that outlet that they're gonna choose from. So there's a couple of examples of how the order of that decision can have an impact on your marketing decisions. And then finally, post-purchase evaluation, or any of the processes that occur once the purchase and typically the use of the product is complete. So this would involve things like the consumer deciding that, well, how satisfied they are, for example. Making an assessment about to what extent did the product actually solve the need that was intended. What have I learned about the product now that I've used it that I didn't know before? And all of this post-purchase evaluation will feed into future decisions. They'll certainly provide a basis for internal information that you may seek in future decision processes. Now, as may be obvious, the way that people go through all of these steps of the decision-making process is dependent upon the type of decision that's being made. And the primary variable that we use to describe types of purchase situations is a concept called involvement. Now, involvement essentially is the extent to which individuals are willing to expend resources on a decision. And this will vary by things like how risky is the decision, what are the consequences of making a bad decision, how extensive is the need, or how far away is my desired state from my actual state. And all these things will cause a person to be more or less involved in the decision. Low involvement decisions, so for example, buying a bag of potato chips, where am I going to go for lunch today? I need some toilet paper, and I don't care much about toilet paper, I just need some. Those types of decisions, they will generally involve little information search, and what information search occurs will be primarily internal. So the next time I'm going to lunch, I'm probably not going to do many Google searches for where should I go to lunch today. In those low involvement situations, heuristics may replace alternative evaluation. Heuristics are essentially just very simplified decision rules. So rather than doing a serious evaluation of alternatives, I might just say whichever one is closest to me, whichever one is cheapest, what's the easiest to do, what did I do last time. So very simplified decision rules to make the decision. And in low involvement situations, post-purchase evaluation also may only occur in the presence of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, of course, being occurring when the outcome of a purchase is significantly worse than was expected. Technically speaking, only very different, but generally we think of cognitive dissonance meaning I got something that I was not expecting, and it's a negative consequence. So in that low involvement situation of buying a bag of potato chips, I'm probably not going to think too much about that decision unless, of course, the potato chips are stale or there's a mouse in the bag or something like that. Then I'm going to engage in post-purchase evaluation and say, oh my God, I'm never eating those Doritos again. So outside of situations like that, though, we wouldn't see much post-purchase evaluation. So that describes the impact of involvement on the decision-making process. It's further supported by these two different charts explaining the decision processes. And this entire idea of involvement and its impact on the decision-making process is described by the elaboration likelihood model. The elaboration likelihood model essentially states that there are two routes to persuasion. The central route, which involves deliberate and conscious effort to process, add content, and claims. So in other words, in a high involvement situation, people tend to be persuaded by logical, rational arguments. When I'm buying a car, tell me it's a good value, tell me it gets great gas mileage, the performance is strong, that's going to persuade me. In low involvement situations, we tend to be more persuaded by the peripheral route. The peripheral route involves little, if any, deliberate effort to process information. Rather, persuasion occurs through association with non-message stimuli, such as music, visuals, humor, and so on. These are called peripheral cues. So in a beer ad, a low involvement purchase, the persuasion process is dominated by telling jokes, having catchy music, having emotional messages that will simply cause me to form positive associations with the brand, and that's persuasion, as opposed to specific message or attribute related claim. So a few models here that sort of explain this elaboration likelihood model and the relationship between message arguments, peripheral cues, involvement, and then brand attitude, which of course leads to purchase intention.
So what does this all mean? Well, at the risk of oversimplifying what is a fairly complex set of analyses, the general way I like to think about this, as you see in the slide here, in low involvement situations, creativity rules. In high involvement situations, message rules. And that's the basic premise of the elaboration likelihood model. In low involvement situations, again, with the peripheral route dominating the route to persuasion, it makes more sense to focus on creativity of message delivery rather than the actual message content of that of your branding. Whereas in high involvement situations, very relevant product related messages, very attribute related messages are going to be more successful at generating persuasion. So again, that's a but an extremely simplified version of the elaboration likelihood model, but gives us a good starting point and a nice sort of directional pattern way of thinking about consumer behavior and the way that involvement levels can impact the way that we craft our marketing messages. So that about does it for week 3. As we finish this up and getting ready for week 4, I did want to point out a couple of things. First, we continue ramping up the expectations here. As with week 3, we'll have the same amount of content, 4 chapters, as we did in week 3, plus we'll have the midterm exam. So a couple points about the midterm exam. It does open Thursday at 5 o'clock. It will close Saturday at 5 o'clock. So you'll have a full, solid 2 days, 48-hour window where you can choose when to do the exam. Once you begin the exam, however, you must complete it within 3 hours. So you can pick whatever 3 hours in those 48 hours to actually do the exam, but you will be limited to one attempt and 3 hours. Now, the exam will be open-ended questions as opposed to multiple choice questions like we've had for the quizzes, so it'll feel a little bit more like the written assignments that you've been doing, except they will tend to be more fact-based, more strategic decision-making based rather than purely opinion. So my expectations will be that you express your decision that you'd make and justify it using the content from the text. Now, speaking of the text, the exam will be done in the lockdown browser, so you will not have direct access to the e-text. However, you are free to use the e-text if you'd like to have it open on a separate device, or if you purchased a print edition of the textbook, you're certainly free to use that. You're certainly free to use any notes that were provided in class, but no other materials other than those things, notes from the class, and well, basically anything that's in my lab, in Pearson's my marketing lab, you can use again the e-text, any notes, my wrap materials can be used, but nothing else. So basically, only things that I've provided to you through Blackboard or through my marketing lab. Anything else will not be helpful to you. So be prepared for that. Understand too that any technical issues that you have with the exam should, especially once you've started or attempted to start the exam, you should go directly to the ITS help desk, which is 650-5500, rather than coming to me, because that'll, generally speaking, will waste valuable time. Most of the time with technical issues, I'll be pointing you back to ITS anyway. So call them first. If it's something that I have to fix, then you can contact me, and I'll try to make sure that I'm available during those hours. And then the last point that I want to make as we get ready for week 4, I'm going to be making these virtual office hour time slots available. So I certainly invite you to schedule a Zoom meeting with me so that we can interact and talk. I'm happy to meet with you as an individual. I'll meet with you in your project groups if you have one. We can talk about the projects. We can talk about the exam. We can talk about any material or just really anything at all. So feel free, once I have that my scheduled time blocks put up, feel free to schedule that time with me, and we'll meet that way. And outside of that, certainly feel free to call, email, or stop by with any questions you have, and good luck going into week 4.